Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you for organizing this interesting conference, and thank you for having me here and giving me the opportunity to present this this speech. And with my presentation, I would like to take you through a stage I've just reached with my doctoral research. So I therefore find myself proposing reflections that are in the process of developing. So I'm open to discussion, and any suggestions or criticisms are of course useful for me. And needless to say, I do not claim to be exhaustive in this talk. And my speech is structured on 4 sections: an introduction, a part on the relationship between Goethe and Schopenhauer, the historical one, a part dedicated to Schopenhauer's philosophy of nature in very briefly exposed, and the last part where I try to outline this familiar resemblance. And so I start with part 1, and I would like to start quoting the advice Goethe gave to young Schopenhauer. He wrote to him, if you wish to enjoy your own value, you must give value to the world. And of course, one would expect similar recommendation from Goethe. For Schopenhauer, however, a philosopher would set his thinking around the attempt of an atheistic redemption from the evil of the world, and would therefore turn his attention to opportunities to overcome this painful dimension. Goethe's advice does not seem to have paid off. On the contrary, it seems to have been more the devaluation of the word that interested Schopenhauer's speculative effort. It should be noted, however, that this undeniable feature of Schopenhauer's philosophy is nevertheless the result of an organic and articulated reflection, proposing a multiplicity of points of view and aspects that lead towards a center that ultimately reveals the metaphysical truth that for Schopenhauer is the word is will, while it is also representation. So Schopenhauer calls his philosophy a, quote, Thebes with 100 gates. One can enter from all sides, and through each gate arrive at the direct path to the center, end of quote. So the single thought, as he calls his philosophy in the introduction of the word as will and representation, has actually to be seen as an organism in which each part is connected to the whole. And this applies to the subdivision of the book itself in 4 main sections, but also to the whole of his production. Therefore, if it is true that the word as will and representation concludes with the examples of saints and ascetics who overcome the world and access the dimension of nuluntas by estranging themselves from the ordinary affirmation and manifestation of terrible, impetuous, contradictory, and conflicting will, it is also true that it is not a definitive and decisive negation of this world. It is not so for several reasons. First of all, as mentioned, this is not the point of arrival of or completion of his philosophy, even if it is the final point of the book. After this exposition, Schopenhauer has found something else to say. So his philosophy has not been really exhaustive. And moreover, if one wishes, one can reverse the order and start from the nuluntas to move in his thought along a different path. Secondly, the total overcoming of the world is a rare circumstance. Certainly the most coveted if one assumes the ethical and metaphysical perspective proposed by the 4th book of the word as will and representation, which is in many respects the apotheosis of Schopenhauerian philosophy, but it is already presented as the unattainable goal, either from the point of view of practical experience or from the point of view of theoretical accessibility. At most, the occasional experience of compassion and especially the enjoyment of art, which momentarily interrupt the circuit of will, come to the rescue. And so we come to the 3rd point. This negation of the will is illuminated only by the section that discuss the counterpart, so the affirmation of the will. In fact, any reference to such a transcendence of the ordinary, contingent, painful, lacerating dimension, all immersed in representing, according to cause-effect nexus and according to the principle of individuation, which are the 2 transcendental devices that perpetrate a constant epistemic caesura between subject and object. However much it tells of possible experiences of ascetics and mystics, it remains inexorably bound to the representation. And this condition decreases the relativity of any speculative and cognitive conceptual enterprise, such as philosophy. For although it projects itself beyond its own phenomenal and contingent dimension, the concepts within which philosophy must be articulated will never transcend the word as representation. The negation of which Schopenhauer speaks is always relative, never absolute, just as the thing in itself is never conceived in absolute terms, since it remains relative to the appearances, which is the framework where we find ourselves whenever we speak, write, or think about any essence. Hence, we find here the definition of his own metaphysics as immanent to the limits of language and knowledge, as is clearly stated in Epiphilosophy, the last chapter of the supplements to the word as will and representation. But it is also addressed also within the consideration of nature, not by chance. So back to Goethe's advice, we can formulate a sort of question. What about the world and its value? So given that the dimension that permeates existence is that of the affirmation of the will, to which even the discourse of Noluntas is dependent and internal, considering that nonetheless we are immersed in a world of deceiving appearances and in a huge illusion, is it really possible to find in Schopenhauer a way to recognize the value of the world as Goethe recommended? And does he assign any value to it? I answered yes, and I believe he does assign a value to the world. And it is a consideration of the world understood as nature, which is external to the subject, yet related to it physically and epistemologically, from a physical and epistemological point of view, that plays in this sense a very crucial role. And not by chance in this, it is in his Metaphysics of Nature that he considers the important issue of the connection of the thing in itself as will to the world. All in all, Schopenhauer attributes some value to the world, and he does so on the basis of his interest in science and his high regard for the scientific enterprise. Here, I believe we can find several assonances with Goethe too, and in particular, I believe they can be found in Schopenhauer's metaphilosophy and his account of metaphysics. So here we have part 2. Goethe and Schopenhauer first met in November 1813 in the literary salon of Schopenhauer's mother, Johanna, in Weimar. By the time the two met, Schopenhauer had already studied at University of Göttingen and Berlin, taking philosophy and science classes. Therefore, when he meets Goethe, he has already a scientific knowledge, and he has already written his first philosophical treatise on the threefold root of the principle of sufficient reason. In his resume, Schopenhauer writes that he discussed with Goethe on all possible philosophical topics, and he describes this meeting with these words, quote, "I count it as the most delightful and significant event of my life," end of quote. Without any doubt, the experience with Goethe and their conversations could only have benefited Schopenhauer, and Goethe was already a reference for him, just as he would remain later in the years. A large number of quotation exergues and examples are taken from Goethe's works and are to be found scattered through his writings. And the first note about Goethe in the Nachlass, it is dated 1810, 1811, is quite significant. Schopenhauer described Goethe as the counterbalance to Kant, who otherwise and alone would have burdened the spirits of the time, Schopenhauer included, I add, like an oppressive nightmare, since Schopenhauer argues Kant never knew what contemplation is and gave birth to the monster of practical reason. So we can see, therefore, how Goethe plays the part of the representative of the alternative, which opens the way to compensate for the despair with art. And we already understand that art in these lines is expected to have much to do with the ethical dimension. And we learn that evidently for Schopenhauer, it is already clear that ethics have nothing to do with reason in the Kantian sense. What is peculiar about Schopenhauer's encounter with Goethe is the period of a genuine scientific experimentation. As is well known, their attention turns to optics, and for Goethe, enrolled Schopenhauer in a sort of scientific traineeship to help him enhance his theory of colors. And he was at that time attempting to refine and implement a part of this theory with Seebeck's help. In this respect, Schopenhauer was given the opportunity to test the knowledge he had acquired in the field of theoretical science, especially in physiology. This led Schopenhauer to propose to Goethe a correction of certain reflections, which Goethe did not follow up, and in the short term, their relationship was broken off. However, Schopenhauer did publish his work on sight and color in 1816, giving Goethe's research a personal twist, intimate in the title, where sight stands for a different standpoint and approach to colors. And Schopenhauer's impression on their divergence is explicitly stated and refers to Goethe's strong objectivity. And for example, he declares about this different point of view, I quote it, Goethe was so completely a realist, he fully refused to consider that objects themselves are there only insofar as they are represented by the cognizing of subject. He once said to me, staring at me with his Jupiter eyes, is the light there only when you see it? No, you would not be there if the light did not see you. End of quote. So according to Schopenhauer, Goethe's robust focus on the objective pole of the color phenomenon was too one-sided, and the subjective pole needed to be further developed, stressing on the physiological aspect of the color perception. In particular, Schopenhauer's reinterpretation intends to shift the Goethean Urphänomen of the polarized mixture of shadow and light into the qualitatively polarized and divided activity of the retina. This is what Schopenhauer interpreted as the cause of their detachment, as if Goethe found it a personal affront. I do not think it is completely so, so maybe there is a sort of misunderstanding starting from Schopenhauer. But leaving this issue aside, we can certainly state that the scientific practice of a Naturforscher like Goethe, so much marked as anti-reductionist, anti-Newtonian, and in many ways also anti-romantic phenomenism, was of great inspiration and usefulness for the maturation of Schopenhauer ideas that in the 4 years that followed gave life to the word as will and representation. Undoubtedly, Goethe's practice is far removed from any scientific or philosophical theorizing or preconstituted abstraction or theoretical bias. And on this point, Schopenhauer could only distance himself from his master. Thus, although he also took on the investigation of nature as his task, he could not refrain from going deeper in order to see under the surface the essence of the phenomena. Schopenhauer's move, thanks to the use of the conceptual tool of the wheel, shifts from the level of the epistemological philosophy of the Kantian transcendental metaphysics to that of the traditional metaphysics, etymologically intended as exceeding physics, as Schopenhauer writes. So, and this is to be intended as nature. So in Schopenhauer, this leads to also to aesthetics and morality, because in order to find a deep significance and redemption from the evil of the world and the suffering of existence, since they are rooted in the very essence of the world. So it is quite, I believe it is quite known, this remark dated 1813, before the meeting with Goethe. I start to quote, "In my hands, and even more so in my spirit, a work is raising, a philosophy which ought to be at the same time ethic and metaphysics, in the point where by now they have been mistakenly separated, as the man has been separated in soul and body." End of quote. So it is by assigning value, a certain value to the word, that the puzzlement emerges as soon as metaphysical questions do. And now we see the role of philosophy of nature in Schopenhauer. So I start with part 3. Philosophy of nature plays a key role in Schopenhauer's thought, and it must be said that alongside with Goethe, also Fichte and above all Schelling's Naturphilosophie have been important inspiration for the development of his ideas. In addition to this, as mentioned, he was also familiar with the panorama of the sciences of his times, on which he always kept up to date. Indeed, in his quest for understanding of the world in the fullest sense of the expression, Schopenhauer gives rise to a metaphysics that pays great attention to natural sciences, which complement and support his single thought. This contribution is present even before the formulation of the metaphysics of the will, when Schopenhauer was still grappling with the better consciousness, as the study of the Nachtlers attests. And the fact that nature is a cornerstone of his thought, which demanded him a lot of speculative effort, can be attested by the many changes occurred in the second edition of The Word as Will Representation, and where he, in the second book especially, where he presents his philosophy of nature. And it is worth also underlining that the first work he published after The Word as Will Representation in 1836 was dedicated to nature. And I am talking of about the essay on the will in nature, with the subtitle A Discussion of the Verification through the Empirical Sciences which the author's philosophy has obtained since its appearance. Hence, this work has the aim to update and at the same time corroborate its philosophy with the contribution of science, which seemed to confirm its metaphysics. Schopenhauer was particularly interested in physiology, as I said, as a new field of study of vital functions and organisms. And in this sense, and thanks to experience with Goethe, by applying physiology to philosophy, Schopenhauer could show increasingly the natural side of the dynamism of the will in the physical process that accompanies representation, intended here in the transcendental sense. So we have representation and we have the neurological cognitive activity. So reason arises as a particularly developed function of the brain in the human being, provided that also animals have a brain and are fitted with intuitive knowledge, thanks to the understanding and sensibility, which are for Schopenhauer simultaneous and woven in the act of knowing and representing. For representation is not committed exclusively to concept sense reason. So by giving voice to the scientific perspective, Schopenhauer reinforces the analogical inference which proposed the explanation of the link between thinking itself and word through the will in the second book of The Word as Will Representation. In fact, by using an analogy which extends the immediate relationship between the body and the will experienced by any subject through her or his body, he philosophically recognized the same essence in every being external to the subject. Moreover, by applying physiology to philosophy, it could strengthen the immediacy of the feeling of the body awareness and the double aspect experienced by the subject between finding herself or himself will and representation. So the second book of The Word as Will Representation starts from this acknowledgement that it is completely impossible, according to Schopenhauer, to identify by cause-effect, and it appears to us through concept only at a later stage, and normally as a motivation of an action. The emergence of the willing impulse of moving a part of our body, for example, does not happen by reasoning, even less if we are dealing with involuntary movements. So we assign a cause a posteriori in order to give the occurrence an explanation and a meaning. So we should, this should be applied according to Schopenhauer to everything. So from the storm to the human being, but recognizing this elusive trait of our self-awareness, of our double state, and this is according to Schopenhauer, an effective heuristic move to access the thing in itself as the essence of the world. So this blind impulse of willing becomes for Schopenhauer the essence of the entire world, and by using will as a denominatio potiori, as a preferable concept, since it is the closest intuition we have of this obscure reality that is the blind spot for representation, we expand its meaning. In fact, will has to lose any human commitments with intentionality, judgment, reason, and so on, in order to explain the whole natural reality which we are part of. The articulation of the unitary essence in the various and multiple manifestations accounts for the diversity that rises in the phenomenal world. And Schopenhauer proceeds by indicating the ascending scale of manifestation from the inorganic to the higher organic manifestation of the will, which is the human being. Science, therefore, offers a conceptual order to an intuition which leads directly to the core of the living essence and allows to refer to the thing itself in a concrete and solid way. But as we saw with the analogy of will, philosophy clearly does not use the same method of science. That is to say, according to Schopenhauer, a systematic deductive cause-effect architecture of knowledge. Despite this, philosophy of nature permits the communication between science and metaphysics. And this is feasible because science and philosophy share the same object of investigation, while they differ in perspective and methods. Science, according to Schopenhauer, looks for the how of the world, while philosophy looks for the quid and asks, what is the world? In particular, for Schopenhauer metaphysics of nature, Schopenhauer metaphysics of nature identifies natural forces as the immediate phenomena of the will that emerge from the formulation of the constancy and regularity recorded in nature through scientific laws. And of course, this is particularly perspicuous when we are referring to inorganic realm. And the more we ascend the scale of nature, the harder it is to give account of the complexity of living beings and organisms, especially when representation and cognition appears. This is why it is very hard to understand human behavior and characters. Anyway, with the laws of nature, we grasp the multiplicity inside the invariability. And this is an example of the help that science can offer to philosophy in formulating the solution of the riddle of the world. And in turn, we see also that science stimulates philosophical questions in the name of double-cross references. The ascending gradation of forms of which the objectification of will in nature consists of manifests a timeless formative process which belongs to an alternative dimension which can be hardly expressed within representation. Schopenhauer introduces to this purpose the Platonic ideas. They serve to account for a non-historical, non-phenomenal dimension, which is the latest threshold where universal and general form are intuited. And this is extremely important to underline to understand his philosophy of nature. In fact, with ideas, Schopenhauer does not refer to concepts or any mental objects, but he says they are original forms, prototypes, types, model, samples, which are intuitive and not abstract. The idea is not a product of the reasoning, and yet is not even completely empirical like perception. In their phenomenality, they are only given within myriads of individuals in space and time. But while these individuals disperse themselves, ideas remain stable, as the rainbow remains still on the waterfall, says Schopenhauer. So the will manifests itself in these extreme images of universal stable forms, the ideas, which absorb the swirling changes and singularities we ordinarily experience in the realm of phenomena. So this is a sort of mediation, it's a level between the phenomena, the representation, and the essence, the thing in itself that is that does not belong to this world. So, and this is enables to detach from the common way of representing, for this is ultimately an intuition. And this is the perspective of philosophy, but it is the same of art. So here we see that subject collapse temporarily in the object and vice versa. So this is the realm of contemplation, and this is namely the world as idea. It is one of the aspects of the world. Now let us go back considering Goethe's influence. So part 4, the last part. From a speculative point of view, Schopenhauer goes far beyond Goethe's morphological, descriptive, and asystematic attitude by proposing a complex and systematized thought, even if in a peculiar sense of system, as we saw. From Goethe, directly and indirectly, Schopenhauer derived many insights, starting from the treatment of genius and art. And in fact, the very figure of Goethe perfectly suits many of the characterization Schopenhauer gives of the poet. And since for Goethe, polarity at a certain point becomes the most indicative and important Urphänomen, in attributing order to the chaotic and elusive dynamics of the incessant forming and transforming of nature, we can find in Schopenhauer the same tendency of moving between unsolvable polarities, starting from the account of the subject-object with representation couples, a trait that is impossible to overcome in representation. Another proximity can be found in the strategy of approaching the understanding of nature by the use of analogy, which also comes from Schelling. And for Schopenhauer, analogy is particularly important since it makes it possible to name the extra phenomenal thing in itself within representation. So the analogy allows to communicate the incommunicable. And in this respect, one can also try to outline a parallel between will and Urphänomen. And this pushing to the threshold of the phenomenon through the metaphysics of nature resemble the Goethean movement that looks out on the chaotic mutation of forms through the intuition of the Urphänomen, that captures the infinite into the finitude, grasps the universal in the phenomenon, the limit between Gestalt and Bildung, and identifies the persistence precisely in the unceasing transformation. Of course, things become more complicated and paradoxical in Schopenhauer's thought, where the transcendental device of representation creates a sort of short circuit in philosophy, whereby what cannot be said is actually said, taking up Wittgenstein. And if therefore for Goethe, it is the becoming that identifies the essence of nature somehow, in terms of what we are allowed to grasp of it, of course, for Schopenhauer, it is not possible to identify any phenomenal characteristic in the thing in itself, such as the becoming of the metamorphosis. So the will has only negative attributes with respect to the phenomenon, and it is outside any change. The incessant urge of affirmation, the creative aspiration of realizing forms, the harmony, and at the same time the conflicts of forces and individuals are once again represented according to our relative ways of understanding the world. And therefore, this explanation does not penetrate into the real kernel of this essence. All this is due to the fact that Goethe's conception of phenomenon and Urphänomen do not overlap Kant's conception of appearance, as in Schopenhauer's happens. And this merger in Schopenhauer's framework also overlaps the Platonic conception of appearance. And in fact, this use of Platonic ideas paved the way for the compensation of the unspeakable nature of the thing in itself inside representation. We know that Goethe's outlook is completely immersed in naturalistic morphological research, and it is an experience of a particular kind. It is an overview, a glance, an intuitive aperçu that goes beyond the series of forms and phenomena encountered in reality. And synoptically, all of a sudden, the gaze of the Naturforscher perceives an order, thanks to the connection of similarity and difference, and finding familiar resemblances. The Urphänomen thus succeeds in expressing a sense of totality, remaining adherent to the particular and innumerable observations of the phenomenon. It provides a phenomenal unified multiplicity without reaching any metaphysical or ontological level. So morphology is an hermeneutics of experience, but Schopenhauer operates a sort of transposition of this method in metaphysics. In the formulation of Schopenhauer's philosophy, therefore, Goethe's role is important and, in my opinion, guides the transformation of the Platonic ideas through the consideration of the Urphänomen, shaping not only his theory of art, but also the philosophy of nature, since ideas have a key role here, as they have in art. And as I said, it has a lot to do with the account of philosophy in its focus on the universal. In any case, what goes beyond the horizon of phenomenon representation is therefore not a totally abstract mental lucubration. On the contrary, according to Schopenhauer, it remains exactly as it was for Goethe, within the sphere of experience, and draws on what is most immediate in it, the intuition that fills concept and anchors them to reality. Philosophy, although characterized by the highest level of conceptual abstraction, must not abandon the empirical ground and real knowledge. Here we can root Schopenhauer polemic against the empty concepts of academics and idealists, for instance, and the broad and synthetic gaze in the sense of contemplation of multiplicity through every aspect of reality in order to search for an overall totality that does not annul differences is indeed Goethe's ways of proceeding between extensive investigation into nature, but it also enters Schopenhauer's account of philosophy. The difference is that Schopenhauer assigned to philosophy, metaphysics, this artistic approach. But for Goethe, this was in fact a scientific approach. The primacy of the concrete over the abstract is clear in Schopenhauer's work. So for this reason, in its paradoxical communication, the anchorage to intuition helps the philosopher not lose himself in abstractions, and at the same time, just like the poet, helps him unveil the what of the word through rhetorical ploys, guaranteeing as far as possible clarity of exposition. Hence, contemplative intuitive experience portend in this sense the hope of redemption from the slavery of will and concepts. To conclude, I think one can better realize what immanent metaphysics means for Schopenhauer if Goethe's influence is taken into account. And I claim that we meet the greatest Goethean contribution for the Schopenhauer thought by paying attention to Schopenhauer account of nature and the value we assign to word. Thank you.